Hello, my name is Ellie Martin Elston. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I'm a first-year social work student in the master's program at the Mandel School. This January, I took a 3-week course with Dr. Fletcher titled Examining Implicit Bias in Everyday Language as Drivers of Racism. It was truly transformational for me. I was able to turn my values into really tangible, actionable pieces and goals that I can accomplish as a result of this course. So I'm excited to share a brief summary of what I've learned. I will give just a blanket credit. Everything I learned in this presentation comes from Dr. Fletcher, her course, her lectures, everything she put together for us. And also the core reading for the class, which was The Everyday Language of White Racism by Jane Hill, was an excellent read. So highly recommend that. And that is where all the credit is due for all of this. A major point of the course was the idea of a folk theory of racism. Jane Hill in her book outlines the ways that folk theory of racism serves as a culturally accepted and reinforced system of beliefs that reinforce the foundations of racism in America. So a helpful way to frame all of this is, in all of my learning in social sciences and in social work, I use critical race theory and critical intersectional feminist theory. These other systems of explanation that help us understand the world, right? Folk theory is also that. It's a way of understanding the world through a system of beliefs. Some of the core tenets of folk theory are race as biological fact. So this means that there are discrete racial groups. They share not just physical characteristics, but personality characteristics and moral characteristics. White people and Black people are inherently different and distinct. And we can identify them with our eyes. In reality, we know that race is much more complicated than that, but it's also pretty superficial, right? We have some physical inherited characteristics that serve as the foundation for this belief, but that don't actually mean anything because, we're all just people. The next tenet of folk theory is that racism is individualistic. So to call someone, and also the second piece here is that racists are a small minority and that's an insult. Jane Hill explained that a lot of people think of racists as like a small minority of people in an isolated part of southern Mississippi. And so to call someone a racist is to insinuate that they're low class and uneducated and all these other things, when in reality, we all uphold the system of racism in the United States. So it also implies that racism is individualistic. So we make individual choices or hold individual beliefs, but that racism is not structural. Another tenet is that folk theory is common sense. So a lot of people are raised and learn folk theory and learn no alternatives, and their primary way of dealing with contradiction is erasure, which makes it very difficult to have a conversation about folk theory with someone if they're not super aware that folk theory is one of many ways of understanding race. And yeah, a lot of people think folk theory is just common sense. So I have 2 examples from my experience with family members. So I was sitting on a couch next to a family member watching a March Madness basketball competition. Is that what it's called? And just happened to mention casually that Black college basketball players are significantly less likely to graduate college than their white teammates, because that was an upsetting fact to me, and I wanted to talk about it. This family member dismissed my comments, saying, oh, they're just not willing to work hard. That's why they're not graduating. This comment really upholds a couple of things. So first, race is biological fact, right? That the explanation for disparities between white and Black people is because of their individual characteristics as a result of the biological fact of their race, rather than all the reasons that I could explain why that trend might be happening. I also had a conversation with a family member that I said, hey, I actually think that's pretty racist of you. I think that's a racist belief, right? That family member responded by saying, if you think I'm a racist, you should meet a real racist, which just highlights exactly that point I made about we use racist as a small minority of terrible people, and the rest of us have no role in racism, right? In her book, Jane Hill outlines how we continue to perpetuate racism without racists and transmit messages and this belief system of folk theory of racism without having any explicit lessons on folk theory of racism. And the way that we do that is through language. So the first way that we do that is through slurs, and the protection of slurs helps to perpetuate slurs in America. So through our freedom of speech, slurs are generally protected. You're generally allowed to use slurs through that right. Whereas there's a lot of other speech that is restricted, right? You can't yell fire in a crowded theater, but you can make a racially charged derogatory slur statement at a person of color. The second way that we do that is through gaffes, which is like unintentional, maybe not always unintentional, but we don't mean to transmit racist beliefs, but we do transmit racist beliefs. We slip up, quote unquote, and say something racist. Because this is unintentional, we tend to focus on the sender of the message, the committer of the gaffe, and say, oh, they didn't mean to hurt anyone. It's harmless. They apologized, whatever, whatever. Rather than focusing on the very real harm that gaffes or racist language of any type has on the people it's directed towards. We also have a tendency to defend white virtue, right? He's a great guy. He's never been mean to me. He has many Black friends. You know, insert whatever we do to defend the person and make it about the person who said the thing and their character, rather than the statement or the belief or, you know, the insinuation of what was actually said. And finally, the erasure of harm is kind of the through line of all of this, right? We tend to focus on who said it, should they apologize, what did they mean by that, rather than the way that every time we speak words to racism, we reinforce it and we commit harm all over again. So yeah, applied, this looks like defending slurs as general insults. So when someone uses a slur saying, it doesn't mean anything racist, it just means stupid, right? That has very serious consequences, us even defending it as that. But we do tend to erase the racist underpinnings of our language. Defending gaffes is accidental. You know, I didn't mean it that way. I'm not racist. Again, perpetuating that belief that racists are a small minority. And finally, we erase the harm that racist statements and racist language has by dismissing it as political correctness or you're just being oversensitive, rather than focusing on the impact of those words and the harm that it has. A major piece of learning for me was the way that slurs are acceptable in daily language in our culture. I have a couple of examples. So the main point, first of all, is that any mention of a slur, a specific slur, even if it's purely for intellectual dialogue or discussion, then especially in popular culture, by famous people especially, it precipitates the use of that slur over and over and over again, which just reinforces the harm over and over and over again. Additionally, Hill points out that slurs are an object of fascination and even pleasure for white Americans. So I have a great example for this. At a prior institution where I was a student, I attended a brown bag lunch. So it was just like an informal roundtable discussion over the lunch hour hosted by a tenured faculty member. This faculty member, I think it's important to note, was a white man. And he didn't, generally for these discussions, someone had a presentation prepared or maybe light reading for everyone to do so that we could discuss. And at this particular lunch, the faculty member just threw out a slur and said, "What do we think of it? Who's allowed to say it? What do you think?" And what was interesting about it was that the faculty member meant to incite discussion and, be provocative. But what that actually ended up doing was alienating the people of color in the room and in the broader department who weren't even there, bringing up discussion of this slur for weeks and months after the brown bag lunch, really multiplying the harm of that slur over and over and over again, even though it was introduced in an innocent way. I have another example from my own field of domestic violence services. We see all the time the way that slurs and racist language really do serve as a threat or as violent in themselves, as harmful to our survivors. But we see that invalidated in court, in domestic violence court and in custody hearings. Our survivors understand that racist language is a reminder of their subordinate position. It's harmful, it's emotionally damaging, it's harmful to the children in the home as well. But really the entire justice system, the judges, the officers involved, really, there's no legal recourse for them. As a result of this course, I was tasked with identifying what steps I'm going to take forward with all of this new learning and all of the resources that we talked about together. I decided I was going to finish this book, which I'm working on, hopefully by the end of February, and then keep reading the other recommendations from the course. We have a whole book list that one of my colleagues shared that I'll be working on. The first 3 books that I'm going to focus on are We Were 8 Years in Power by Ta-Nehisi Coates, Racism Without Racist by Bonilla Silva, and Reclaiming Our Space by Feminista Jones. I also made a commitment to follow one of my passions, which is shopping local and shopping small in terms of the businesses that I frequent. I want to really add to that, focusing on Black-owned businesses. And finally, in my field placement, where I work at a domestic violence shelter, I keep a field journal where I reflect on interactions and things I notice at work, and it really helps me process and learn. So I want to bring this newfound attention to language and microaggressions and racism there. The action steps in terms of advocacy that I am committed to taking, I want to bring more attention to taking quarterly action. That feels really doable to me right now. I've kind of been a sporadic volunteer for SURGE, which stands for Standing Up for Racial Justice. And I'd like to commit to about every 3 months taking some kind of action. I'd also like to identify a social work professional organization that's focused on anti-racism that I can get involved with as a professional throughout my career. And finally, I'd like to bring anti-racist activism into my conversations with mentors. So as a student, I'm constantly reaching out and talking to new people in the field, reaching out to old mentors, old bosses, people who can just help me keep my network strong in the field. And I'd like to bring to that talk about what we're doing to combat racism in the field and in our daily interactions.